Hello, everyone. Welcome to the May edition of Stay at Home Lectures, sponsored by the Society for the History of Medicine and the Health Professions. And I'm Tim Nutt, Director of the Historical Research Center at UAMS. And the Historical Research Center is the only archives in the state that is dedicated to the preservation of the history of medicine and the other health sciences in Arkansas. We're located on the UAMS campus in the Education 2 building, and I'd like to invite you to come by at some point and visit us. I'd love to give you a tour of our facility now that campus is sort of opened back up again. I'd love to welcome you to the Historical Research Center and show you some of the artifacts that we have in our collection. As I mentioned, tonight's lecture and this entire series is sponsored by the Society for the History of Medicine and the Health Professions, which is the friends organization for the Historical Research Center. And the Society supports the Historical Research Center in a number of ways. They allow us to purchase books that we might not be able to otherwise afford or get for our collection, our History of Medicine collection. They support programming such as this. And they also just provide a lot of assistance in other ways, including hosting an annual dinner and lecture for the Historical Research Center and to provide programs and lectures for the history of medicine in Arkansas. Speaking of the annual dinner, we are still hoping that we will be able to have our annual dinner later this year. It's been canceled for the past 2 years, but hopefully we'll be able to have it later this year, and I'll keep you posted on that. If you'd like to become a member of the society, the dues are a pretty good deal, actually. It's $5 for student membership. You do not have to be a student at UAMS. You can be a student at UA Fayetteville, ASU, or anywhere out of state. And individuals are $15. The URL for membership, you can see it on your screen right there. If you want to bypass that, you can go directly to paypal.me/shmhp and you can pay your membership dues there, and I would encourage you to do so. Tonight, as I mentioned, this is the May edition of the Stay at Home Lectures. We've been doing this since April of 2020, if you can believe it, that we're 2 years into doing this series. The presentations happen the first Thursday of every month from 7 to 8, and the Zoom link that you use to get here tonight is the same link that you can use all the time for these stay-at-home lectures. So I hope you'll join us in June, where I'm still working on the presenter and the topic for June, but I hope you'll come back in June. If you'd like to be put on our email list, you can do so. And I'll put my email in the chat feature, and you can send me an email if you'd like to, if you're not already on the email list and you'd like to be informed of programming. So tonight I am happy to introduce Dr. Bill Gurley. Bill used to be on the faculty here at UAMS in the College of Pharmacy in the Department of Pharmaceutical Sciences. He left us a year or so ago to go to Ole Miss, where he is the principal scientist at the National Center for Natural Products Research in the College of Pharmacy. And tonight he's going to be talking about an amazing doctor from Texas, Dr. Henry Dye, who was stationed in South Arkansas and just had a really fascinating documentation of the patients that he worked on. So I'm going to ask Bill to turn on his camera and unmute himself, and I'm going to pin him up there, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen so Bill can do his, and I'm going to turn it over to you, Bill.
All right, thank you, Tim. Let me get everything up and going here and see if we can Can everybody see that okay? I hope so.
Yeah, you're good. You're good, Bill.
Right. Excellent. All right, so we'll move things along here. Again, I want to thank Tim for the introduction and the opportunity to speak. I've actually given this talk a couple of times at UMS way back in the day, so some of you may be familiar with it to some extent, but I'm always trying to change it up a little bit. So anyway, the title, Yankee Bullets, Rebel Blood, the Illustrated Medical Casebook of Dr. Henry M. Dye, Confederate surgeon in Arkansas or the Trans-Mississippi. And so today, when the subject of Civil War medicine is broached, the first image that often comes to mind is a surgeon and his assistants in bloodstained uniforms or aprons, brandishing knives and saws while leering over a soldier laid upon a makeshift operating table with a horrible wound to an arm or leg. And in this oft-repeated scenario, the standard doctrine is to amputate. And in our preconceived image, of course, there's no anesthetic, and the soldier must either be held down manually while taking a shot or two of whiskey or biting on the proverbial bullet to help him endure the pain of amputation. This imaginary scene, however, rarely ever occurred in the American Civil War. And that's not to say that amputations weren't the most common operation to perform and that surgeons weren't very proficient at the procedure. But we must dispel the hackneyed bite the bullet notion, because virtually all amputations were performed under the influence of chloroform or ether anesthesia. And Hollywood has been the principal perpetrator of the myth that Civil War surgeons were nothing short of glorified butchers whose sole purpose was to amputate. Yes, Civil War medicine was crude compared to today's modern practices, but it was also a transitional period where significant advances in medical care were made, many of which have carried over to the present day. Now, much of our knowledge about Civil War medicine, surgery, and pharmacy comes from the multi-volume medical and surgical history of the War of the Rebellion. And these voluminous records give us an idea, or actually they're a phenomenal description of how medical care was conducted primarily in the Union Army. Not that medicine was practiced any differently in the Confederate Army, but medical records from the Confederacy are much less extensive, and those that have survived come to us either from the Army of Northern Virginia or the Army of Tennessee. And so with regards to the medical and surgical history, it's a several volumes, over 6,000 pages. It took 21 years to complete. And how it was put together was reports and records from all Federal surgeons throughout the war were submitted to Washington, D.C., and they went through and edited them and compiled them and published this very nice historical record. They finally came out. The last issue came out in 1888. There are over 6.5 million diagnosed episodes of illness that are described in the medical and surgical history. There's over 250,000 records about treatment of wounds. And this includes actual photographs as well as drawings and even some early photomicrographs. But sadly, by the time the last volume came out, it was pretty much obsolete because medicine had changed significantly in the 2 decades since the end of the war, with the implementation of germ theory and Koch's germ theory and Lister's principles of antisepsis. And so a lot of the approaches were obsolete by the time they came out. But nevertheless, they still give us a phenomenal insight into how medicine was practiced then. Now, in terms of just the Confederate Medical Department, here are a few basic facts about that particular department. There was over 3,000 medical officers in the department, 1,200 surgeons, and over almost 2,000 assistant surgeons. There were a whole host of civilian contract surgeons. These were fairly common in the Arkansas area. Like the Federal Army, record keeping was a staunch requirement for the Confederate Medical Department, and this was primarily at the urgence of Surgeon General Samuel Moore. There was a Confederate Association of Army and Navy Surgeons, and they actually conducted research, and they had their own journal called the Confederate States Medical and Surgical Journal, and it was published primarily during the last 2 years of the war. Sadly, the vast majority of Confederate medical records were destroyed in April of 1865 when Richmond was burned. And so there are virtually no, there are records that exist, as I mentioned, primarily from physicians in the Army of Tennessee and the Army of Northern Virginia, but virtually no records exist describing Confederate medical care west of the Mississippi River, which is what we call the Trans-Mississippi Theater. And so when we refer to the Trans-Mississippi, we're basically talking about those states west of the Mississippi River, including what was known then as the Indian Territory, but it's today Oklahoma. And extrapolations of medical and surgical practices in the Trans-Mississippi can be made from these other documents from other physicians in the other armies, other Confederate armies, as well as those that are documented in the medical and surgical history of the War of the Rebellion. Now, brief glimpses of medical care west of the Mississippi River can be obtained from a few published accounts. A book that I was instrumental in editing several years ago is called I Acted from Principle, the Civil War Diary of Dr. William M. McFeeters. And McFeeters doesn't go into a lot of specific details. It's a great diary, but there's not a lot of specifics. Letters of a Confederate surgeon are the letters of Dr. Junius Bragg, who was a Confederate surgeon of 33rd Arkansas, and Bragg was from Camden, Arkansas. And like McFeeters' diary, Dr. Bragg doesn't get into a lot of details in terms of medical or surgical details. And then another commonly referred to publication with regards to medicine west of the Mississippi River is a book entitled A Texas Surgeon in the CSA, which is the letters of Dr. Edward Cade, who was in the 28th Mississippi, the 28th Texas Dismounted Cavalry. Now, and again, the descriptions of the medical care in each of those volumes is fairly cursory. But recently, I say recently, but it's been several years now, a unique record fills this void. And this is a document, it's a remarkable hospital journal of Dr. Henry Montgomery Dye. Here's a relatively new picture that I found of Dr. Dye. And so Dye was a native of Plano, Texas. In fact, his family founded the town. And he began his medical education at the University of Louisville and later graduated from Jefferson Medical College in Philadelphia in 1861, literally at the outbreak of the Civil War. And upon his return to Texas, Dye joined what was known as Captain Alf Johnson's Texas Spy Company as its field surgeon. And the Spy Company was basically a cavalry unit. And so it, along with Dye, was assigned to Little Rock, Arkansas in April of 1862. And it's there that Dye begins his chronicle. Now, Dye's journal is perhaps one of the most detailed in existence, and it's the only known source that describes the surgical and postoperative treatment of individual Confederate soldiers in the District of Arkansas. And even more spectacular are the journal's illustrations, the originals of which some of the illustrations were in color. And so it's not uncommon for physicians to have case books, but it's extremely uncommon for them to be illustrated. Now, the journal is a ledger type that was commonly used during the era, and it's over 100 pages in length. And in the first few pages of the journal, which encompass the period from April of 1862 until the evacuation of Little Rock in September of 1863, Dye describes various aspects of medical care in Little Rock hospitals. And during this time, Dye is assigned to the Rock Hotel Hospital in Little Rock as an assistant surgeon in charge. And then later, he's transferred to the St. John's College Hospital. And although his entries are not especially detailed during this period, he does provide some very good descriptions of the hospitals in Little Rock and just general observations regarding healthcare in Arkansas's capital city. Now, I will say the vast majority of the entries are when he was at the General Hospital in Princeton, Arkansas. And then towards the latter part of the journal, the entries are primarily when he's at the General Hospital in Magnolia, Arkansas. Now, as I mentioned, the most extensive section of the journal is devoted to cases describing wounded soldiers that Dye cared for in the Texas Division General Hospital at Princeton, Arkansas, following the Battle of Jenkins Ferry. And Dye's hospital was actually the Dallas County Courthouse. And so the Dallas County seat at the time was in Princeton. Today it's in Fordyce. And so for those of you that are unfamiliar with Princeton, Arkansas, it's just a little small, actually it's just a little crossroads today. That's about 1.5 hours south of Little Rock on Highway 9, and about 16 miles from the Jenkins Ferry battlefield. And so this little map shows you, here's a drawing of the Dallas County Courthouse, and you can see a map that I took from, I acted from principle and drew in I-30, and kind of give you an idea of where Princeton is relative to Arkadelphia and Little Rock, and also in its relationship to Jenkins Ferry on the Saline River. Now, it was standard procedure for physicians in both armies to keep a medical casebook, as I alluded to earlier, and record keeping and monthly reports were submitted either to Richmond, Virginia for the Confederate services, or to Washington, D.C. for the Federal Army. And these were important because it allowed improvements that were being made in medical care to be shared with other physicians on both sides. And so the following is from the regulations of the Confederate Medical Department with regarding the implementation of casebooks. And so it states that the senior medical officer of each hospital, which was Dye in this case, post, regiment, or detachment, will keep the following records and deliver them to his successor: a register of patients, a prescription and diet book, a case book, copies of requisitions, returns of property, and reports of sick and wounded, and an order and letter book in which will be transcribed all orders and letters relating to his duties. And so this allows us to have some understanding of how daily health care was conducted during the Civil War. Now, Dr. Dye sketched each case using ink, maybe some colored pencils, perhaps even some watercolor paints. The original journal is no longer with us, and we can talk about that after the talk. Many of the sketches are simply line drawings of the patient's head, limb, torso, and oftentimes showing an entrance or exit wound, while others depict the entire subject in various postures. And accompanying each illustration, Dye identifies the soldier by name, age, and unit affiliation, and provides a detailed description of the wounds and the prescribed course of treatment. And frequently, entries are made on a daily basis as a means of documenting the patient's progress, which is a practice not unlike that of modern physicians who enter progress notes in a patient's hospital record. Dye even includes statistics for both federal and Confederate cases. And we'll talk about why he has some federal cases a little bit later. Additional cases document patients that were housed in the General Hospital at Magnolia, Arkansas in the spring of 1865. And all the cases are no doubt typical of the care provided to Confederate sick and wounded at any time during the Civil War in Arkansas. And so here are a few more examples of pages from Dye's journal just to kind of show you what they look like and how the journal is set up. And so we're going to discuss a few of the cases, a couple of which are shown here. Now, what follows are 10 of 130 cases detailed by Dr. Dye, which describe soldiers wounded at the Battle of Jenkins Ferry. And a couple of other examples will illustrate interesting prescriptions, as well as some statistics with regards to different procedures. And so for those unfamiliar with the Battle of Jenkins Ferry, it was the culminating action in the Arkansas theater of the Red River Campaign. And so this is a map that I took from Principal that shows the routes of the Confederate armies during the Red River Campaign. And so after thwarting a federal incursion along the Red River at the battles of Mansfield and Pleasant Hill, Louisiana, near Shreveport, 3 Confederate infantry divisions marched north into Arkansas to confront a second federal force that at that time was holed up in Camden, Arkansas. And Confederate forces under General Edmund Kirby Smith and Sterling Price forced the Federal Army under Frederick Steele, up there in the upper left-hand corner, forced Steele to evacuate Camden, and then they pursued Steele on his retreat march to Little Rock. And then early on the morning of April 30th, 1864, in the flooded bottoms of the Saline River, 1 mile south of Jenkins Ferry, the Confederate pursuit of Steele's column finally ended. And so this slide depicts a map drawn by Confederate engineers of the Jenkins Ferry battlefield, showing the narrow confines of the battle bounded by the Saline River to the northeast, Cox Creek to the northwest, and then there was a swamp to the southwest. So it was a very narrow corridor in which the fight took place. So here in a driving rainstorm, as his wagon train struggled to cross a river over a hastily constructed pontoon bridge, General Steele deployed one of his Union infantry divisions as a rear guard. And sensing an opportunity to bag the federal force, Confederate General Smith and Price fed their foot-weary Confederate infantry divisions into the battle as they came onto the field. And in a series of piecemeal assaults, General Thomas Churchill's Arkansans, followed by General Mosby Parsons' Missourians, and finally by General John G. Walker's Texans, hammered the compact Federal line that was ensconced in a belt of flooded timber. Now, slogging through mud and water at times up to their knees, the Confederate attackers were checked in an open field fronting the Federal position. You can see that field there in the middle. The submerged battlefield precluded the deployment of artillery, which forced the contest to be decided by small arms fire. And after 4 hours of vicious combat, the Federals withdrew. They destroyed their pontoon bridge and made good their escape. And losses on both sides were especially heavy, approximately 15% casualties on each side, which translated to about 1,000 Confederate and 600 Federal casualties, including the mortal wounding of 1 Federal and 2 Confederate brigadier generals. Now, you'll notice I've just highlighted a portion of the map, and maybe you can see it there. It says battery lost. And so this dovetails into the following movie clip from the movie Lincoln, which opens with the scene of fighting from the Battle of Jenkins Ferry. So let's see if we can get this started, and hopefully you can hear this and we'll understand the few times that Jenkins Ferry gets national attention.
Some of us was in the 2nd Kansas Colored before the Rebs at Jenkins Ferry last April, just after they killed every Negro soldier they captured at Poison Springs. So at Jenkins Ferry, we decided we weren't taking no Reb prisoners, and we didn't leave one of them alive. The ones of us that didn't die that day, we joined up with the 116th U.S. Colored, sir, from Camp Nelson, Kentucky.
What's your name, soldier?
Private Harold Green, sir.
I'm Corporal Ira Clark, sir, 5th Massachusetts Cavalry. We're waiting over there. We're leaving our horses behind and shipping out with the 24th Infantry for the assault next week on Wilmington. How long have you been a soldier?
2 years, sir.
2nd Kansas Colored Infantry, they fought bravely at Jenkins Ferry.
That's right, sir.
They killed 1,000 rebel soldiers, sir. They were very brave. And
Okay, so that opening scene of the movie Lincoln depicts a Hollywood version of the attack of the 2nd Kansas Colored Infantry at the Battle of Jenkins Ferry. And about the only accurate aspect of the scene was that the battle was fought in ankle to knee-deep mud and water of the flooded Saline River bottom. And at one point in the battle, the 2nd Kansas Colored Infantry and the 29th Iowa Infantry did overrun and capture a section of 2 cannons from Captain Samuel Ruffner's Missouri Battery. However, only 3 of the captured Confederate cannoneers were shown no quarter by the 2nd Kansas. Now, the melee in the mud never happened. Virtually none of the fighting was hand-to-hand, and not one bayonet wound was reported by Dr. Dye or any of the other surgeons that were in attendance. Moreover, none of the 2nd Kansas Colored Infantry ever traveled east of the Mississippi River, and certainly none of them ever had a conversation with Lincoln. But nevertheless, Lincoln was a pretty decent movie, despite some of the historical inaccuracies regarding Jenkins Ferry. Now, for those of you that are unfamiliar with the Jenkins Ferry battlefield today, here are a few views. The upper left is the current site of where the Federal pontoon bridge crossed. The upper right is a view of the Saline River bottom looking north from the high ground south on the battlefield. And the battlefield is located to the left of where the highway, and this is Highway 46 that ends in this photo. And about a half mile off to the left is where the fight was. And the 2 lower photos are taken of the area where the military road parallels Cox Creek and where most of the heaviest fighting took place, and where the 2nd Kansas Colored Infantry captured those 2 Confederate cannon. The actual battlefield today is on private property and is usually inaccessible to the public. And like the battlefield in 1864, the area is often flooded in the springtime. Now, since the battlefield was too wet for deploying artillery in 1864, the battle was primarily fought with small arms. And to have a better feel for the types of gunshot wounds Dr. Dye was treating, one needs to have an appreciation for the types of bullets that were flying around at Jenkins Ferry. And what we have here are several types of non-fired Civil War era bullets used at Jenkins Ferry. The most common calibers range from 52 to 69 caliber. Now, these were paper cartridges, and what we're seeing here is just the business end of the ammunition. And I've compared those to a modern 44 caliber metal cartridge so you can see how the massive size of some of these bullets. Because the lead used in the Civil War bullets was especially soft, it underwent significant deformation when a solid object was struck, especially if that solid material was bone. And these are some fired examples of bullets recovered from Jenkins Ferry battlefield. And so when a 57 or 69 caliber mini ball hits bone, oftentimes the bone was just shattered into splinters. And in the case of a leg or arm that happened to be hit, such an injury would often necessitate amputation. So most of the cases discussed in Dye's journal are of Texans from Major General John G. Walker's Texas Infantry Division, but there are a few of Arkansans and Missourians. Now, according to Dr. Dye, the wounded were triaged on the battlefield and then moved 8 miles to the General Hospital at Tulip, Arkansas. And depending on their progress, the patients were moved an additional 8 miles to hospitals at Princeton, Arkansas, and the more serious cases were eventually transported to Camden and Washington, Arkansas. And so I just want to show you a few of the cases. And so the first one is case 14, and it's Walton Robinson. He was a member of the 18th Texas Infantry Company H, and Dye says he was 23 years of age. And here's what he had to say. Mini ball entered the thigh at the middle of the upper third and ranged downwards and backwards, lodging beneath the skin, from which place it was extracted, passed external to the femur. So this is primarily a flesh and muscle wound. Here's the entrance to there's where the bullet entered, and you can see here towards the back of the thigh is a little bump here, and this is where the bullet was excised. And so we have a nice view of Mr. Walton's rear end there as well. Dye goes on to say that he primarily ordered water dressings in order to treat Robinson's injury. He says, so ordered water dressings, recovered and transferred to General Hospital at Washington, Arkansas. And so from Robinson's service record, we know that he was 5 feet 11. He had black hair and black eyes, and he was a resident of Coffeyville, Texas. Sadly, his service record is incomplete, and little is known of his activities following his transfer to the hospital in Washington, Arkansas. And he doesn't appear to have filed for a pension after the war. So that's really about all I know about Robinson. Dye was a great proponent of using water dressings, especially cold water dressings, and this type of dressing was deemed essential by the Confederate Medical Department for treating all types of wounds. And there was actually a very popular manual of military surgery published by Dr. Julian Chisholm, and he had this to say about cold water dressings. He says, keep away all hot dressings, which invite blood to depart. The only dressings required for wounds of whatever character is the water dressing, and it should be used as follows. Apply a single thickness of wet linen or cotton cloth over the wound, allowing it to extend over a considerable surface. Squeeze cold water frequently upon this surface. And it would certainly have been very helpful back then if that water had also been sterile. Now, as a pharmacist and pharmacologist, I find the next case especially relevant today, even as it was in 1864. And this is the case of Captain William Langford. And he was in Colonel Hiram Grimstead's 33rd Arkansas Infantry Regiment. And here's what Dye has to say. Was wounded at the Battle of Jenkins Ferry by a mini ball entering the outside of the right arm about midway on the ulnar side, comminuting the bone. Comminuting just basically means it destroyed it. An incision was made over the latter the next day after the battle, 6 inches long, from which fragments were removed. The edges of the wound are very much gaped and suppurating freely. Suppurating just means a free flow of pus. On the 6th day at night, he awoke nearly in a state of syncope from the loss of blood. The hemorrhage was promptly relieved by means of a ligature placed around the arm above the elbow. I called to see him at 1 o'clock the next day and found the hemorrhage arrested. But from the condition of the bedding and the pallidness of the captain's face, there was strong evidence of profuse hemorrhage having occurred the night previous. I applied a tourniquet to the arm above the elbow and removed the ligature. The dressing was left in status quo until the next morning, giving him, during the night, 1 grain of morphine. And his next note is on May the 9th. The hemorrhage occurred again at 12 o'clock today, but ceased upon reapplication of the tourniquet. Several doses of morphia had been administered to him during the evening, under the influence of which he was now laboring. While I was absent from the room, he ordered the nurse to hand him the vial of morphia, from which she took such a large quantity that it proved fatal at 2 o'clock at night. Now, from Langford's service records, we know that he was 26 years of age. He was a member of Company E, 1st Arkansas Infantry, and was wounded at the Battle of Shiloh early in the war. And then while he was recovering in Arkansas, he joined the 33rd Arkansas Infantry as a member of Company K in 1863. And then his service record with the 33rd Arkansas ends just prior to the Battle of Jenkins Ferry. And so ultimately his demise is not recorded. Nevertheless, Langford's fate was a harbinger for many other opioid-related deaths and addiction issues that would skyrocket during and after the war and have continued to plague our society today. So opioid usage is a two-edged sword. It's effective. It has effective pain relief on one hand, and then potential toxicity and addiction on the other, as we're all well familiar with, or we're all well aware of that. The next case is one that involves W.B. Stiles, who was a member of Pendle's Battalion of Missouri Sharpshooters. And Dye entitled this case False Anus. And so here's what he had to say. Ball entered 2 1/2 inches above and slightly to the inside of the superior spinous of the ilium and passed into the cavity of the abdomen, wounding the descending colon, and made its exit 2 inches to the left of the spine. Very slight inflammation resulted from the injury, and for 9 days, feces passed through the usual channel. Since that time, the feces have been escaping through the wound made by the ball. Then he notes, recovery good, furloughed. So here you can see he's got entrance of the ball, and then he says false anus. And so actually, as a result of his meritorious conduct at Jenkins Ferry, Stiles would be named by Brigadier General Mosby Parsons to the Roll of Honor, which is equivalent to the Medal of Honor in the Federal Army. And so Stiles' unusual wound was technically referred to as a stercoral fistula, and it was not unique. In fact, in the Medical and Surgical History of the War of the Rebellion, in a chapter devoted to injuries of the pelvis and primarily to wounds of the rectum, several cases of stercoral fistula after shot wounds of the rectum are detailed. And the Medical and Surgical History describes this type of wound as the occurrence of abnormal anus after shot perforation of the rectum. And there was a greater persistency in fecal fistula in this region than in those communicating with the colon. The frequently attended osseous lesions satisfactorily account for this, the discharges from carious bone and occasional escape of sequestra, keeping open sinuses that might otherwise contract and close. So you got some 19th century description of describing why these fistula occur and why they remain open. In this Medical and Surgical History, they described 37 cases of these stercoral fistula. And for those patients that didn't succumb to the injury, all were permanently debilitated to varying degrees. And actually the figure at right is from the Medical and Surgical History, illustrating a Federal soldier with a stercoral fistula from a wound received at the Battle of Spotsylvania. Okay. Now, the next case is probably one of the most interesting cases in the entire journal. And that's the case of Captain William Nunn, who was a member of the 8th Texas Infantry. And this is what Dye has to say. Wounded at Jenkins Ferry, April 30th by a mini ball, which entered immediately the frontal sinus above the right eye, passed through the cavity, and made its exit 1/2 inch above the left eye, fracturing the inner table of the skull, allowing 1 ounce of cerebral substance to escape. This condition being so hopeless, the surgeon neglected to remove the fragments of bone. For 2 weeks after receiving the wound, the cavity made in the frontal sinus by the exit of the ball remained open, allowing the pulsation of the brain to be plainly seen. During the past 10 days, however, the cavity has been filled with granulations. This condition has been removed with the application of nitrate of silver. This case has been marked by very slight constitutional disturbance, except a watchfulness that existed for more or less 2 weeks. Cold water was first applied, and after suppuration was established, water at a temperature to suit the sensation of the patient was all the treatment used locally. The bowels were kept in a soluble condition by sulfate of magnesia. His memory has been impaired slightly, and a very small degree of mental alienation has originated from it. Then he makes a note on June the 7th. A small fragment of bone was lifted out of the wound, since which time he has been improving rapidly. And at present, on June the 15th, is walking about and will soon apply for a leave of absence home. So here we can see a picture of a picture of Captain Nunn. We've got entrance and exit wound. And so On April the 22nd, 1865, almost a year after his injury, Nunn returned to service in the 8th Texas Infantry. Now, at the time of his wounding at Jenkins Ferry, Nunn was almost 44 years old. And so just a little information about Nunn. In 1853 to 55, he was a state congressman representing Williamson County, Tennessee, but moved to Hill County, Texas soon after. Then after the war, Nunn returned to Texas where his first wife died in 1873, but he remarried in 1875. And also on the slide is a post-war image of Nunn. Now, owing to the poor quality of the photo and Nunn's advanced age at this time, it's difficult to determine just how good a rendering of Nunn Dye had sketched. Now, in A History of Rummels County, Texas, the author had this to say about Captain Nunn, quote, "During the dark and trying days of our country, he was a noted officer in one of the most gallant regiments that ever went out on behalf of the lost cause, and will carry to his grave the fearful scars he received on those combats. He was a gentleman of rare culture, a zealous and devout Christian, and a pleasant and agreeable neighbor." Now, unfortunately, no pension records exist for William Nunn. However, we do know that he would die at Acton, Texas in 1893 at age 73. And this was 29 years after his wounding at Jenkins Ferry. Now, here's a similar case to that of Nunn's that appears in the medical and surgical history of the War of the Rebellion. And certainly most gunshot wounds to the head in the Civil War were often fatal. But of the few that did survive, they often suffered from some type of compromised mental status, which is what Dye described with regards to William Nunn. Now, the next case is number 62, and this is of Frank McGill and his Company F, 3rd Texas, age 38, and then Dye says Mexican, was wounded by one of our own men, the ball entering the back part of the left arm 2 inches and 1/2 from the shoulder joint, ranged forward in front of the bone and made its exit on the opposite side, only plowing through one side of the humerus. The hand could be raised by the patient to his head after the injury. Notwithstanding this, the arm was amputated at the shoulder joint while in the hospital at Tulip and was admitted here June the 1st. At that time, the stump had nearly cicatrized, which means it had almost healed over. But a small abscess had formed at its lower edge from which was discharged some pus. He makes a note on June the 10th, took erysipelas. And erysipelas is a 19th century term basically describing a streptococcal infection of the skin. Took erysipelas of a superficial character commencing at the wound, which spread over 1/2 of the body, attended with small vesicles. Was removed to the ward set apart for that purpose and put up tincture of ferric chloride, 30 drops every 3 hours, and iodine dissolved in glycerin applied locally. By the 12th, commenced improving, and at this time, but little trace of the disease is to be seen. It spread all over the back as far as the lumbar region posteriorly and umbilicus in front. Discontinued the iodine now and am now using lead acetate ointment. He makes a note on June the 22nd, improving, taking 20 drops tincture of ferric chloride 3 times daily. The erysipelatous inflammation does not affect the condition of the stump, but very slightly. And so you can see that this is probably one of the more colorful drawings that Dye probably made. And here you can see it says arm amputated at the shoulder, attacked with erysipelas. And at the bottom there it says vesicles. And so when I'm doing research on all these guys, there was no soldier named Frank McGill or anyone with a similar sounding surname that appears on the rolls of the 3rd Texas Infantry. However, a Frank McGill does appear on the rolls of the 16th Texas Infantry. And according to 2 published lists of casualties for the 16th Infantry at the Battle of Jenkins Ferry, Frank McGill of Company C was dangerously wounded in the arm and the note says was since amputated. Now, McGill's service record also noted that he joined the 16th Texas at age 36 and therefore would have been about 38 at the time of his wounding. So why would Dye refer to McGill as being Mexican and in the 3rd Texas Infantry? Well, it's quite likely that Dye has confused McGill of the 16th Texas with a soldier named Isidro Esquivel, a member of Company D, 3rd Texas Infantry, or maybe vice versa. According to Esquivel's service record, he was 34 at the time, and which would make him close to the age that Dye says here in this journal. Further evidence for Esquivel being the patient in this case is that in a register of casualties that was incurred by the 3rd Texas Infantry that was published in the Galveston Weekly News, A soldier by that name was listed as having been wounded in the shoulder and his arm was amputated. Therefore, it would appear that Dye has conflated these two cases, as both soldiers were likely admitted to the Texas Division Hospital at Princeton at about the same time. Unfortunately, no pension records could be found for either soldier. So who is the mysterious Frank McGill in case 62? In all likelihood, I think it's Isidro Esquivel. Now, the next case is 67, and this is of Frederick Stubing, another member of the 16th Texas Infantry. And this is what Dye had to say. Ball entered the left foot on the inside in the front of the ankle joint and ranged downwards and backwards, precise location not known. The foot has become very much swollen, attended with extensive abscess with burrowing of pus. Several orifices exist now from which pus makes its escape. Skin red and shiny. Was admitted June 1st from Tulip. But on June the 14th, he notes, abscess was discovered on the right hip over the trochanter major of an indolent character. 4 ounces of pus escaped from this abscess through an incision made with a bisturi. And a bisturi is a long knife, a narrow blade that's used to incise abscesses. He makes another note on June the 23rd. The glands about the groin are swollen this morning and painful, complains of aching. Wound continued to suppurate profusely, and pus of the metatarsal bones continued to pass from different orifices in the foot until he was transferred to Camden. Then he also makes a note, nutrition good. Now, a letter written by Private Stubing on June the 25th, 1864, just 2 days after Dye's last entry, is in the manuscript collection of the Butler Historical Center there in Little Rock. Now, it's extremely rare to find letters from patients commenting on their care, but I certainly want to share this one with you. And as I mentioned, it was written just 2 days after Dye's last entry, and it's noted. And here's the letter that Stubing wrote to his brother. It's dated June 25th, 1864, General Hospital, Princeton, Arkansas. Dear brother, seek myself to drop you a few lines to let you know that I am getting along well at this time. I am wounded in the ankle, and I have suffered a great deal with it. I've never walked any yet, and there is no prospect of my walking soon. My foot got worse for the last 10 days, but it is getting better now. The women of Princeton treat us very kind, and they bring us everything we want, and there are more pretty girls here than I ever saw at one place in my life, and they bring us apples and plums and all kinds of fruit. We'd fare very badly here in the hospital. If it was not for the women, we would starve. They send us some things to eat every day. There are a great many wounded here, and they are bringing more every day. Direct your letters to General Hospital, Princeton, Arkansas. Write soon and often. I remain your brother, Frederick Stubing. Now, Stubing's wound would prevent him from returning to service. And when the war ended, Stubing was at home in Bastrop County, Texas, recovering from his wound. And then in October of 1914, Stubing applied for and received a pension from the state of Texas. Stubing died in Bastrop County, Texas on July the 28th, 1926, at the age of 85, according to his pension of organic heart disease and senility. And again, this was 62 years after his wounding at Jenkins Ferry. Now, this is one of my favorite portions of the whole journal. And this is, Dye titles this Novel Prescription for Rheumatism, Neuralgia, Ague, Fever, etc. And so here's the prescription. Green frogs, 1 dozen. Capsicum, 1 ounce. Adepswilla, which is Latin for pig fat, ½ pound. Aqua, or water, 1 quart. And then here's a prescription. Make strong decoction of the capsicum in the water, then drop in the frogs alive. Afterwards, put in the lard and make ointment. Rub skin in chills and parts affected by rheumatism and neuralgia. And at the bottom, it says, Arkansas doctor. So at first glance, this seems like the proverbial witch's brew, but in reality, it was a prescription 140 years ahead of its time. Today, many unique drug candidates have been isolated from skin secretions of frogs. And we'll discuss later why frogs may have indeed been a novel component of this prescription. Capsicum, as we well know, is a term for cayenne peppers. And the chemical that causes peppers to be hot is called capsaicin. And it's not uncommon today to purchase capsaicin-containing products in the pharmacy to treat muscle aches and pains. So again, this old Arkansas doctor was well ahead of his time. And again, we'll come back to the frogs towards the end of the talk. Now, the next case, number 94, is that of Adam Quincy Clements, who is a member of Company I, 3rd Texas Infantry. And here's what Dye has to say. Ball entered the middle of the upper third of the left thigh and ranged upwards and backwards, lodging among the gluteus muscles of the same side, from which place it was removed on June the 20th. A large abscess having formed, the operation was performed while under the influence of chloroform. The patient will weigh 200 pounds and is very muscular, age 38. The ball in its course fractured the trochanter major, which is the head of the femur. The limb has been allowed to remain in an extended position and has been treated with, you guessed it, cold water dressings. He was among the number who was left at General Randall's Brigade Hospital owing to the serious character of his wound. He makes a note on July the 3rd. There is a very imperfect union between the ends of the bones, yet the profuse purulent discharge from the wound is fast telling upon his system, though he is of a vigorous constitution. And so clearly he developed some type of osteomyelitis. Now, on September the 1st, Dye notes, quote, sent to Camden, improving very much, nutrition good, gaining flesh, slight shortening, limb straight. Now, we have a post-war account of Clements's ordeal. And after Clements's wounding, his brother and the captain of their company carried Clements to the bank of Cox Creek on the Jenkins Ferry battlefield and left him with a tin cup so he could quench his thirst. Clements was later removed from the battlefield by litter bearers to a nearby church being used as a hospital. And 2 days later, surgeons recommended that Clements's leg be amputated. According to the family lore, Adam vehemently protested and said while wielding his side knife, quote, I'll kill the first man that attempts to cut my leg off, close quote. Now, so the surgeons left him to die. The next day, another young surgeon claimed that Adam was being neglected and proceeded to clean his wound and eventually extracted the ball and fragments of bone. Clements teetered on the brink of death for several weeks, but eventually recovered enough to hobble around with a crutch. According to family legend, when his affected leg healed, it was 5 inches shorter. Now, Adam continued to convalesce in various hospitals up until the war's end. After the war, he made a 450-mile trip to Bell County, Texas on horseback. His loved ones had given him up for dead, but when he rode into the front yard of the family home with his crutch across the saddle, his mother came out and screamed, Adam, Adam, the dead has come to life. Now, Adam's injury precluded him from manual labor, but he discovered he possessed a beautiful singing voice, and for the next 15 years, he made his vocation by giving voice lessons and concerts in the area. Now, there's a lot more about Clements, but I'm just going to end it with this, that he died in Kerrville, Texas on June the 7th in 1919, 55 years after his wounding. Now, here we have a photograph from the Army Medical Museum showing a federal soldier who was wounded almost identically to that of Clements. And here we can see that the wound has healed and that one leg is much shorter than the other. And if you'll notice, there's a prosthetic shoe on the table. And on the sole, it says 4.5 inches. And on the back heel, it says 6 inches. So that gives you an idea of how much that leg shortened. The reason that these legs shortened is that they didn't go in and try to surgically repair or put pins or rods in. They basically hoped the joint would close. And it did oftentimes, by what was known as the formation of callus bone. Callus bone was being deposited between the two ends. And so by doing that, it markedly shortened the leg. And so these are just some pathological specimens that are in the Army Medical Museum and that are part of the Otis collection. And you can see where there have been several other wounds exactly like Clements's, and they've shown how they healed. And so this is the formation of this callus bone. Now, the next case is case 108 of Mr. T.P. McKinney, who was a member of the 11th Texas Infantry and who was 24 years of age. And here's what Dye has to say. Wounded by a mini ball, which entered the outside of the right foot immediately below the external malleolus and ranged forwards, traversing the tarsal bones and made its exit near the toes at the median line, fracturing the bones and lacerating the parts extensively. Amputation was performed next day after the battle at the middle of the lower third of the leg, which situation proved to be too low. As usual, spicules of bone were removed afterwards. 6 weeks after the operation, the wound was attacked with erysipelas of a phlegmonous character, which extended to the knee, dipping down to the textures comprising the articulation, causing a high grade of inflammation, and much tumefaction, which is a 19th century term for extreme inflammation in this part, and finally extended as far as the hip on the affected side. Abscess formed below the knee midway from the stump to the knee. No suppuration occurred in the joint or parts above. He makes a note on September the 2nd. The stump has healed entirely and the knee can be flexed slightly. Stimulating liniment is used daily with friction with the naked hand to the knee. And so basically Dye's performing physical therapy on this fellow as well. One of the most interesting aspects of this sketch is Dye's use of a straight back chair and cushion positioned so as to achieve a reverse Trendelenburg position. And this is one of the more detailed sketches in Dye's journal. Now, McKinney's wound prevented him from returning to his unit. And in April of 1865, according to his service record, he was still absent, recovering from his wound, but we know nothing about his post-war experiences. Now, on several instances, Dye provides statistics regarding the morbidity and mortality of his own patients, as well as those of federal captives. And so a lot of the federal soldiers were operated on by federal surgeons on the battlefield, or sometimes the federal surgeons stayed with the federal wounded until long after the battle was over. And so Dye had an opportunity to compare and contrast how the amputations were performed in both sides. And so in one example is presented here where he comments on the federal amputation technique and its shortcomings. And in this instance, there was a 40% mortality rate among the federal amputees when the circular amputation technique was used, compared to the flap method that the Confederates often used. Of the 15 cases of circular amputation of the thigh performed by federal surgeons, only 10 recovered, whereas all of those in which the leg was removed close to the hip, they all succumbed to the operation, which really wasn't uncommon throughout the war. Because the closer you amputate a leg to the torso, the more likelihood there's going to be a fatality. All those whose arms were amputated with the circular method, they survived, as you can see here. And Dye remarks that the protrusion of bone caused by the circular technique often required additional surgery. So that's what he mentions there in his remarks. So, and he does several other of these statistical comparisons in the journal. Now, this next case is Dye entitled it Jaundice Attended with Profuse Hemorrhage from the Bladder. And this is a case of Edwin E. Harris, who was actually a physician. He was actually the chief surgeon of General John B. Clark's Confederate Cavalry Brigade. Now, I'm not going to read the entire case because it's way too long, but in the end, Harris died of liver failure at Princeton, Arkansas. And what's interesting about this case is that a collection of Dr. Harris's letters resides at the Gilder Lehrman Institute for American History in New York City. And by reading Harris's letters, we learned that he had taken several furloughs during the war due to his bouts of jaundice, one of which lasted almost 3 months. And what's interesting is that Dr. Dye wrote the very last letter in the Harris collection, and he wrote it to Harris's daughters, detailing their father's demise. And in that letter, Dye notes that Dr. Harris was buried in the Princeton Cemetery with his grave marked by a plank inscribed in pencil. And then 4 years after the war, Dr. Harris's daughters placed this marker in the photo here at his grave. And the stone still resides in the Princeton Cemetery today. And so it's cool things like this with this cross-referencing of primary research material that makes historical research so much fun and rewarding. I had no idea that Harris's grave was still there until one day I just went out to the Princeton Cemetery and boom, there it was. So anyway, the last case is one that Dye entitles A Case in the Person of a Negro Boy in Whose Esophagus a Chicken Bone Was Lodged. And this is September the 12th, 1864. Dye says, quote, "The boy is the property of Mr. Henderson near here," which at that time was Magnolia, Arkansas. "Last Friday, while eating the wing of a chicken, a bone was impacted, and in this condition he was brought to my office on the 11th. Unable to swallow fluids of any kind, tenderness upon pressure on each side of the throat opposite the Adam's apple. I obtained a piece of whalebone, on the end of which I fastened a piece of sponge. This I introduced into the esophagus and passed it almost to the cardiac orifice. bringing it up and down several times along the tube, by which means the bone was dislodged. Now, certainly that procedure was done under the impact of chloroform anesthesia. And I was asking myself, where in the world would you get whalebone in Princeton, Arkansas? And then I was told by a reenactor that it likely came from a woman's corset, because whalebone was used in women's corsets in the 19th century. So Dye basically just improvised an instrument to do what needed to be done. All right, so to conclude, from the cases depicted here, there's a new insight into medical and surgical care in the Trans-Mississippi Department. The perception of Civil War surgeons as glorified butchers whose only recourse was amputation must be cast aside and their approach to patient care reassessed. From the pages of Dr. Dye's journal, it's clearly evident that many Confederate surgeons in Arkansas were practicing medicine that was not only state-of-the-art, but in many instances can be considered on the cutting edge. Examples include the use of iodine dissolved in glycerin as a topical treatment for erysipelas. Now, by July the 4th, 1864, Dye had seen 500 men with erysipelas, not one of whom died of it because of his use of iodine dissolved in glycerin. And even though Joseph Lister's antiseptic techniques and Robert Koch's germ theory of disease were still a few years in the future, the antibacterial properties of iodine were unknowingly yet successfully applied. Now, Dye's incorporation of cayenne pepper into a fatty base as a topical treatment for rheumatism presaged the modern use of such preparations, the modern capsaicin containing creams, by 140 years, actually about 150 years for that matter. Even the prescription related to him by an Arkansas doctor for an ointment utilizing a decoction of live frogs seems more prescient and less bizarre, especially given the recent discovery of potent analgesics isolated from the skin of Central American poison arrow frogs. In fact, there's a compound isolated from those frog skins in South America called epibadidine that's 1,000 times more potent than morphine. And recently, similar, although less potent analgesic compounds have been isolated from the skin of certain North American frog species. Moreover, the skin secretions of many North American frog species have recently been shown to have both antimicrobial and wound healing properties. And so clearly, this old Arkansas doctor was way ahead of his time. Now, Dye, like many other Civil War surgeons, demonstrated that gunshot wounds to the extremities were not an immediate cause for amputation. In fact, Dye describes only a few amputations in his journal, and those that are performed have a low incidence of mortality. Moreover, Dye criticizes federal surgeons for their more liberal approach to amputation, a practice that, according to Dye's statistics, resulted in a much higher postoperative death rate for the Yankee wounded. Dye's description of Captain William Nunn's altered mental function following injury to the frontal lobe of the brain is one of the earliest of its kind in American medicine and further illustrates his aptitude for clinical observation. Now, it's regrettable that he did not describe in greater detail Nunn's, quote, watchfulness or his, quote, mental alienation and memory loss. He might have made some important contributions to the neurosciences. Dye also recognized the contribution of poor personal hygiene to deleterious health effects. For example, in one of his quarterly reports, he notes that, quote, the general habits of the soldiery as it respects personal cleanliness are bad, in consequence of which, through neglect, the emunctions of the skin become obstructed, thereby producing many of the cutaneous diseases which have prevailed. Better health would exist, I have no doubt, if commanders in the field were to pay more attention to the personal cleanliness of the men while stationary, and the habit of wearing the hair short encouraged. Long hair is unmilitary, and especially during the summer months, unhealthy. Now, who would have known that? Anyway, finally, Dye's journal illustrates both literally and figuratively that Confederate surgeons in the Trans-Mississippi were, for the most part, well-educated, innovative, and possessive of a high degree of surgical and general medical skill, a concept rarely ascribed to participants in this often neglected theater of the Civil War. Now, you can find a few more examples of Dye's cases in the chapter that I provided to this book. It's entitled The Earth Reeled and Trees Trembled, Civil War, Arkansas, 1863 to 64, which was edited by Mark Christ. And many of you probably know Mark Christ. He's one of the preeminent Civil War historians in Arkansas. And it was published a few years ago, but I think you can still purchase it at the bookstore at the old State House. You may be able to find it at the Arkansas Territorial Museum, or you may find it on Amazon too. So for that, I will be happy to appreciate your patience and allowing me to read a lot of those cases. And I will end this, and we can, do you need me to go back to you, Tim?
Yeah, I am here, and if anyone would like to ask Bill a question, please use the chat box. We'll Bill will do his best to answer it, I guess. I have while we're waiting on questions to come in, Bill, how unusual, I realize that this is probably a extraordinary case with illustrations and that, but did most doctors during the Civil War keep a case book?
Yes, they were required by the Confederate Medical Department to do that. Yeah.
Okay.
Not many of them survived. I know there's one other case book that's in the archives at University of Arkansas, Fayetteville, and I think it's a Dr. Brown. As a great case book, but it's not illustrated. And those are the only two case books that I know from Confederate surgeons. Definitely in Arkansas. There may be one in the Tulane archives, but I'm not sure it's very complete. I think it's bits and pieces. So these are extremely rare, especially on this side of especially on your side of the Mississippi River. I would say mine. I'm not over there anymore. But there are a couple that exist from the Confederate Army of Tennessee and from the Army of Northern Virginia. But again, you can probably count on both hands a number of Confederate case books that are still in existence.
Mm-hmm. We do have one question that came in. Were there any references to women helping with nursing patients?
No, there were not. The only mention that Dye doesn't make any mention of. He talks about some women that he meets in the Princeton area, but in terms of allowing them to assist in the hospital there, he doesn't mention that. And in fact, most of the nurses at that time were males. Although, as you heard from Stubing's letter to his brother, that had it not been for the women there in Princeton, they probably all would have starved to death. But so, did women contribute to the healthcare? No doubt. There's no doubt that they did. It's just that Dye doesn't mention them frequently in his case book. Now, they could have been helping him. They could have been right by his side, and he just didn't mention it. So, so that's the answer. That's my answer to that question.
And then we have another question. Did you run into a Dr. Cole from Owensville who was at Jenkins Ferry? Charlie Cole Chafin talks about her family's stories about him. Charlie Cole Chafin used to be in state government.
No, that's news to me. I would, if there's anything that's useful, I would love to have somebody put me in either contact with the Cole Chafin or the family, or I'd like to read that. Absolutely would. That's the nice thing about doing these types of presentations is you reach out to other people that have other contacts. And as you well know, the network, sometimes it can be quite good and sometimes it can be very, disrupted. And so, yes, if there's an opportunity that anything related to Jenkins Ferry in terms of physicians, federal or Confederate for that matter, that might help solve a few mysteries about Dye's journal, I'd love to have them.
And I know you're working.
And so Tim's got my contact information. If somebody wants to reach out to Tim and get my email address, we can certainly correspond if you want.
Yeah, and I'll put my email address in the contact or the chat rather, in case anyone wants to be put on the mailing list, and then I can put you in touch with Bill as well. And I know you're working on a book about Dr. Dye. What's your timeline for that? Yes,
I've been saying that for quite some time, and it comes in fits and starts. But of course, the journal's been transcribed for many years now. And I went in and cleaned up a lot of the drawings in Photoshop, just to get some of the other extraneous material out of the way, so it makes it more presentable. So that took a while. And then what I've really been focusing on, and not only is defining all there's this huge glossary of terms because you have a lot of these 19th century terms that are no longer used. And so a reader would look at that and go, what in the world is that? So that's, that takes up some time, has taken up some time. But of late, what I've really been interested in is finding out the post-war lives of these fellows, of these young men in many instances. A lot of them, as you saw, or as you heard in a couple of instances, provided or applied for pensions after the war. And in those pension applications, a lot of times they'll ask the pensioner or the pension applicant to describe his wound, or a lot of times you'll have to have a physician there who will say, yes, this guy is infirm to the point that he requires a pension. And so the physician will describe his current condition. And so you can match up a lot of those. And a lot of the cases match up quite interestingly. And there's some really nice material that's come out of those pension records. Not everybody filed for a pension, but I was shocked at how many in Dye's patients actually did file for a pension. And so that's been helpful. And that's not a trivial task to track all those guys down. And so there's also, you'll find, like, for example, the Stubing letter that I found at the Butler Center. I'm sure there's probably some other stuff out there. There's a lot of these local county histories in Texas and Missouri and Arkansas that may have some mentions about certain individuals. And so I'm still trying to find out. I'm trying to give it a little more of a human interest approach as opposed to just all this 19th century medical stuff, which is interesting to people like ourselves, but to a general reader, it's also nice to know what happened to these guys after the war and so on and so forth. So that's why cases like William Nunn, who had basically the battlefield frontal lobotomy, and how he survived and what he did afterwards. And he was a very accomplished fellow after the war too. I didn't get into all the details, but so that's what's been taking that's what I'm doing at the moment, is trying to type a lot of those loose ends. So I've only got a handful of those left. So my goal is by the end of the summer to have it finished up. I've got a few more tables and stuff I've got to put together, and then write a few introductory things here and there. But I would say it's 90% finished. And I do have a publisher that's interested in publishing it too. So that's always good.
I'm looking forward to the finished product. And I
Yeah,
know
it's
you probably are too, I imagine.
yeah, and it's been kind of going back and forth as to how best to set it up, and so ultimately the publisher is going to decide how best they want to do it. There's two ways I think are best to approach it, but they may want to do it a different way. And so ultimately it's kind of going to be in their hands as to how best to do it. One is to have the case on one side, and then all the notes and other information on the opposite page, as opposed to going to the back and going through all the notes or going to the footnotes at the bottom. So I've seen that done in one other instance, and this might work for that. We'll see. We'll see how if they'll go with that.
We have one more question before we end for the night. And how many of Dye's patients did you find pension records for?
Yeah, so I found pension records for about 70%, roughly. Most of them are from Texas. There are a few from Arkansas. Found a couple from Missouri, and then a lot of these guys that joined Texas units after the war, they may end up in Louisiana, or they may end up in Tennessee. And so, or I found one guy in Alabama. So you basically have to go through all the pension records of all the Confederate states to try to at least be thorough to track these guys down. And some of them just didn't apply. And there's a lot of restrictions for you to apply for a pension. You had to be a certain age. You had to be, you could only own a certain amount of property. You could only be worth so much. So there was a lot of constraints that were imposed on the pension applicants. And then on occasion, I'll find a pension application from one of Dye's patients' spouse. And so you'll have some of those. I've got a few of those, and they'll give a little bit of information, but they're not nearly as detailed as the pensioner himself. And some of those can be some are not very detailed, but thankfully the vast majority of them go into quite a bit of detail. And so you can match it up exactly. Yeah, this is what Dye did, is how he treated him, and this is how it's affected this guy, so many years later. And a lot of these guys are, you know, are severely are debilitated to the point they can't use a hand or an arm or whatever. So it's that in itself has been very enlightening and gives you a different take on what these guys suffered after the war, you know, and all the stuff that they had to deal with, and you know, and how successful they were despite their infirmities.
We have one more question.
Okay.
Have you checked for obituary records for the patients?
You know, I haven't delved into all of that yet. A lot of times if a spouse applied for a pension, they will tell when the previous pensioner passed. And so I haven't, I probably should do that. I've been able to find out how, you know, again, from some of the other records I've found. I'm not a genealogist, but if someone wants to I've got a handful of situations where I'd love to have a good genealogist help me track down some stuff if it's possible. And so, you know, it's literally, you could go to the ends of the earth to try to track down all these guys, you know, so there's over 130 individuals, and that's a lot of folks, and it takes a lot of time. And so that's one of the things I've been a little bit hesitant about delving into to any great extent, although it probably should be done. And knowing me, I'll probably do it to some extent, just because it satisfies my own curiosity. Because once you deal with these guys and you read their cases and you're going through and looking at their service records, you want to know what happened to them. You know, the vast majority of these guys, they made it, you know, and they lived for quite some time. I mean, you've seen some of these guys live for 50 years, longer than that after the war. So it's, you know, these were tough guys, you know, these were young guys for the most part, you know, so being young and being wounded, you know, if you're going to get wounded, it's best to be wounded while you're a young fellow, as opposed to, you know, somebody in the middle, you know, but like Nunn was 44, and 44 in, you know, in 1860s was, you know, not like the 44-year-old today. And then, you know, you have to realize just getting something to eat and getting a decent drink of water back then was not a trivial task, you know. And so, you know, that's why disease was rampant. And, you know, and Dye talks about, you know, there's a lot of things he's doing to really help his patients along, and help them to survive. Just some of his he's a phenomenal clinical observationist. And one more thing while I've got it. So at one point in the journal, he's describing a case that we call spurious vaccination. And so during the Civil War, smallpox was a killer, and you had vaccinations for smallpox. And what they did was they would take if someone had smallpox or cowpox, and they would harvest the scabs from the pustules after they healed over, and then they would use those to inoculate people because it had the virus in the scab, and they would usually get a milder case of the disease. Well, the way they did that was they basically just made an incision in the deltoid muscle and just rubbed this non-sterile scab into it. And invariably, these things would get infected, and sometimes they would become septic. And in one case, Dye's describing a case of these, they called them spurious vaccinations, where these individuals got septic, and several of them died. And he's going through and observing this, and he's describing what he thinks is going on. And what he describes is the germ theory of sepsis. It's clear as day. That's exactly what he's doing. He has no idea that's what he's done, but he's going on, you know, it has, and it's just, so that in itself, to me, was just remarkable. You know, just how perceptive this fellow was. And again, this predates Lister's and Koch's contributions by, you know, several years. You know, so again, you got to think about this guy in the wilds of South Arkansas at the end of the Civil War, who's, you know, really doing really good medicine at that time, way ahead of the curve. So there's a lot of cool things in the journal, and there's a lot of other real cool cases that you know, if I'd like to do it. Well, ultimately, you'll be able to read about all of them. So.
Well, you do have one offer, a volunteer offer to help you with that. Craig Scott has offered to help you with those.
Oh, well, listen, if you would give Craig my contact info, man, I'd love to, because I'm not a genealogist and I'm not claiming to be. I'm not really sure I want to go down that path, but it would be nice to exchange some ideas and, you know, just kind of spitball the idea with Craig and just see what he would suggest. And, you know, certainly would be would certainly acknowledge him, and depending upon how far we go, we might even make you a co-author on it. We'll see. Like I said, the vast majority of this stuff is already done, but and I also have I have an emergency room physician who's also helping me with regards. So that's another thing we want to do, is look at, in not all cases, but in several select cases, is to compare and contrast how dye treated the individual then and how they would be treated today. And so that's been some interesting comparisons. But again, despite what might be considered the crude nature of Dye's approach, it was the best they could do at the time. And in most instances, his patients survived. So, and at the end of the day, that's all you want, you know.
Well, Craig says that you two have met, that Parsons is his first half cousin, 7 times removed, and you two have talked in
Okay.
So he already has your contact info.
Okay, great. Well, like I say, if I don't see somebody on a regular basis, I'll forget. So yeah, Craig, shout at me. I can update you on some cool parts. There's another book I'm working on, is the history of Mosby Parsons Confederate Missouri Division that served in Arkansas the entire war, and that's been a fun project too. But anyway, that too. I'm a scientist by training, but a historian by heart. So so any help I can get from anybody else, I would certainly appreciate it, and I would do likewise for them. So.
That's great. Well, thank you, Bill, so much for being here.
You're welcome, Tim. I always enjoy talking about Civil War, and I always enjoy talking to my Arkansas friends. I miss all you guys. I miss all my librarian buddies, Suzanne and April and Susan Steelman and Sheila Thomas. And, you all are just, helped me in so many ways over the years, and you'll be internally indebted and miss you guys tremendously. So,
well, we miss you as well.
And I will say this, the History of Medicine Center is a gem that it's unfortunately not enough people recognize the value of that gem that you guys have, and you guys have really done a phenomenal job with that. And so very few. I've been to a couple of other medical universities. They have a quote history that pales in comparison to what you guys have. So if there's any administrators out there listening, do not let this languish. This is truly a gem for UAMS, and it's an extremely important resource. So.
Well, thank you for that. I'm going to, once this
video, and that was an unsolicited advert.
It was. I didn't even have to ask you to do that.
Yeah.
Well, thank you again. You be safe, and we'll look forward to the publication of your book. And we're just so glad that you were able to talk.
I'll give you a heads up as it gets close.
Yeah, please do. Please do.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone, for being here, and we'll see you next month in June. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.